Hello and welcome to Committee Corridor. Clean power by 2030. That's the ambition set out by the Prime Minister as one of his 5 central missions. But what does it mean? The government says it's a secure and affordable energy supply. It's the creation of essential new energy industries and the need to limit our contribution to climate change. Today we're asking how the government is getting on, given that 2030 is just 6 years away. I'm Toby Perkins, the Labour Member of Parliament for Chesterfield and Chair of the Environmental Audit Select Committee, also known as the EAC, at the House of Commons. Clean power is electricity from renewables. That's power from wind, solar power and bioenergy. In the government's plan, this will be backed up by nuclear, gas with carbon capture and storage, and hydrogen. An unabated gas supply will be used only when essential. The aim is to ensure a reliable and low-carbon network of power for the UK. Later we'll hear from Select Committee members Harriet from the Scottish Affairs Committee and Claire Young from the Select Committee that examines the government's work on energy security and net zero. But first, Chris Skidmore is the former Energy Minister under the last Conservative government who signed the UK's net zero pledge into law in 2019. He resigned as a Conservative Member of Parliament in protest at former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's plans to support new oil and gas licences. Chris now chairs the Climate Action Coalition and recently launched the Global Clean Power Task Force. Chris, welcome to Committee Corridor. Why did you think a new task force on clean power was needed?
Great to join today, Toby, and great to see you again. I decided actually that I wanted to put together a task force of sort of leading organisations and companies to be able to help support the government's clean power mission. Obviously, we've got mission control, Chris Stark. We've got obviously now the industrial strategy. We've got the government beginning to make real progress on their sort of commitments towards net zero power by 2030. But when I did the net zero review under the previous government, I found that if you're able to get the backing of a wider sort of community of institutions, organisations, businesses, they also want to be involved. We've got the government obviously has set out the direction of travel. We know what they want to do, but there's still quite a lot of detailed work, granular work that needs to happen to be able to make it happen, but above all, also win public support and trust.
Well, I mean, on precisely that point, the Climate Change Committee recently released its first assessment of the government's progress on reducing emissions. And it says with more action, the UK can hit its legally binding climate targets and improve energy security for households and businesses across the UK. Do you feel that we're moving fast enough to hit this deadline of clean power by 2030? And what more action do we need to see?
So I think, we can never take this outside of the global context. I think often we think, well, this is the UK's mission, but if we look what's happening abroad, I mean, China alone in May deployed 104 gigawatts of solar power. The UK's commitment on solar is 70 gigawatts by 2035. I actually sort of feel that things are changing so rapidly, both in terms of the S-curve of the costs of the technologies coming down on batteries, for example, but we're in such a different place almost to where we were a couple of years ago that we could even be going further. I think that it's right now that we should be going for our 2030 target. I was initially a bit sceptical about it, but that things are moving on so fast that we've got to keep up with the rest of the world. And it isn't just about decarbonising or reducing emissions, as I said. This is actually about making sure our own economies and our own businesses are fit for the future, that they are both sustainable but are embracing the latest technologies. And the growth of AI as well is bringing down the demand of use of energy on our grid as well, and able to fast track industrial decarbonisation in ways that weren't possible several years ago.
I mean, the government sees the creation of new energy industries as key to hitting that 2030 deadline. That's a very wide field, from renewable energy projects to hydrogen energy, small modular nuclear reactors. Never mind how we store and manage our energy. How do you think the UK is doing on the new energy industries front?
So I think the government is right to try and find what's called comparative advantage. So sort of, we can't do everything. We're not going to be able to out manufacture the Chinese on solar panels. So, obviously picking and choosing, not necessarily winners, but we can pick the races that we want to run in. Nuclear is one that I have always supported and supported through the Net Zero Review, partly because I think there's cross-party agreement still in place, even if there's not cross-party agreement for net zero anymore. And obviously, I resigned as a member of parliament and left the Conservative Party over their rollbacks on net zero. But everyone seems to be pro-nuclear, partly because nuclear has that sort of ability of creating a well-paid jobs, of supporting local communities, of being sort of quite tangible, high-profile infrastructures. In Somerset, where Hinkley Point C is being built out, it wasn't too far away from my constituency. That was 28,000 new jobs, of which 70% were local, and they had to open new further education training colleges to cope with also generating the training of the skills demand, and then that those sites are then in place for the next 50 years, so people can understand, they can see it. I mean, you can't always you can't see carbon dioxide emissions reduction, so people don't know what's happening. I supported Sadiq Khan's suspension of the ULEZ and got summoned into the chief whip's office for sort of trying to sort of say, well, actually it's a cross-party thing. But it's much more difficult with things like ULEZ to be able to. It takes longer for the evidence to be gathered to be able to say, right, this is actually led to improvements in education. This has led to healthcare improvements. It does happen, but it takes a while, and that time lag is really difficult for politicians. Finding those industries where actually the time lag is minimal, and you can say, right, we'll get boots on the ground. This will be delivered, and I think for the Labour government, you've got this target of 2030, which coincides obviously with the 2029 general election, if that's when it takes place. You'll want to be able to say we've got this in place by 2029. So I think sort of prioritising those industries where they can show that they've shifted the dial, we can also take advantage of what's happening in the States. You mentioned obviously uncertainty of investors if there's political instability, but we have a government with a massive majority, and that does provide certainty for investors. The government can deliver on what it wants to because it has that majority. And in the States, there are investors saying, you know what, we're not going to invest in the States in the way we were going to, but we're looking to the UK as a safe haven in a storm.
And I mean, Great British Energy, this is what the government has called its national energy champion. A permanent CEO has just been appointed. What is its role, and why was it set up?
Because it's called Great British Energy, it sounds like it could be all things to all people, and actually it's quite focused on its role. I think when it was created, again, sadly, it didn't have cross-party support because I think my former party sort of felt that it was some kind of nationalisation was taking place. That's anything of the kind. I think if people look to understand technology policy, you do need a supporting hand in government. GB Energy are taking technologies that can be deployed and are helping to back them. And I think that is something that is really welcome, because it's not always going to be the private sector that's going to get involved to start with. GB Energy, along with the National Wealth Fund, can provide that catalytic sort of capital. And I think what's really interesting is that Dan McGrail's just been appointed as CEO. I actually did a report with Dan last year called Out of Crossroads, and he's someone who's been long committed to understanding how to make the renewable energy transition work well. I've got great confidence in Dan's abilities to be able to deliver on this. But their first announcement as GB Energy was to support putting solar panels on hospital roofs in hospitals in Lincolnshire. And Dan actually came to speak to our UK task force actually for our first session, and he was saying that the key thing about this announcement that GB Energy made on putting solar panels on hospital roofs, people might have thought, oh, it's a bit surprising you're making that as your first announcement. But again, the narrative framing is that 5 kilowatts worth of solar panels is not much that's gone on the roofs of the hospital, is going to save the equivalent in money of 50 doctors' salaries. So, reframing the narrative about, this isn't just about net zero. This isn't just about reducing emissions. This is about putting more money, found money effectively, back into the system. And where better can you demonstrate that than within the NHS?
And the House of Commons Energy Security and Net Zero Committee has published a report recommending much clearer guidance to support planners and developers. And the report is called Gridlock or Growth, Avoiding Energy Planning Chaos. And in terms of the work that your committee is doing, how much of an issue do you think planning is? And should government just have a free pass when it comes to this sort of infrastructure?
There's a really interesting point now where it's not quite joined up in terms of you've got obviously the industrial strategy, these sectors have been set, these national priorities, critical infrastructures, and the mission control has sort of said this is what we're developing now. This is the clean power plan. We've had the solar roadmap, we've had the onshore wind roadmap, and they're going to get on with the job. They've got the establishment of the National Energy Systems Operator, and on the other hand, you've got the devolution bill, which is creating obviously a large number of mayoralties, and with that, new powers that are devolved that will impact the energy transition. Some of that's obviously around reducing energy demand, which I sort of feel in the UK we've always made the poor relation to energy supply. Everyone wants to talk about renewables and deploying clean power. But obviously, if we reduce our demand, we don't need as much clean power, and also huge co-benefits on health and putting more money in people's pockets. And that will be delivered by these regional authorities. But they'll come up with regional plans as well for decarbonisation for their energy supply. How is that going to meet and match some of these national critical infrastructure projects, and how are we going to resolve some of those tensions? So I think when it comes to planning reform and grid reform, they're going to have the national critical infrastructure projects where permissions will be given and granted, and you've got to overlay that then with this sort of whole new emerging direct democracy sort of movement of the mayoralties. What happens if you get a mayor, like we've just got a mayor in Lincolnshire who's not particularly pro net zero? Are they going to try and sort of use the planning system perversely to try and sort of stop things from an ideological perspective? So I think that next year is going to be really critical as we move towards that 2026 milestone in the devolution space. Once the bill gets passed, we've got to think about how those two worlds join up correctly, and I think that'll be a key part of the focus of the task force as well.
And should we see the oil and gas industry and renewable energy sector as complementary or as competitors? And they're often pitched against each other, but yet the government acknowledges we may still have to rely on unabated gas for some time to come. And do you think we get this wrong sometimes, or do you think we should see a reduction in oil and gas as a part of that renewable energy journey?
International Energy Agency, the UN have all said, we don't need any new additional oil and gas facilities. But, oil and gas that exists already is enough oil and gas being produced, more than enough, as we begin to decarbonise. And the world is about to reach, we may have even passed it, sort of peak oil, as they call it. So actually, we're going to see oil and gas decline rapidly, particularly in the UK, where the deployment of heat pumps and EVs alone, as the Climate Change Committee has demonstrated, will reduce our need for oil and gas by 40%. There is a challenge around making sure that industry transitions effectively, and obviously the fantastic, skilled engineers and all those people that are involved are exactly the same people we need to be involved in both the renewables industry, but also the carbon capture industry, as we seek to decarbonise the oil and gas industry itself. And I was interested in actually going further on the oil and gas industry to say, well, actually, we should be looking at something called geo-zero. So for every ton of CO2 equivalent they extract, that then they should put a ton of CO2 back in the ground. And they're the best people to be able to do that. So I'm not anti oil and gas, is your question. I just think that it's a bit like what happened with the coal mines and Margaret Thatcher and Arthur Scargill, is that, Thatcher knew that it was becoming uneconomic to continue to mine coal in the UK. There wasn't enough coal left in the seams, and also you could buy it cheaper abroad. And there was just market forces meant that the industry was slowly going to decline. The industry, there should have been obviously an argument around transition and supporting those coal miners, but it was an industry that was on the way out, and I think that some people are playing the role of Arthur Scargill now and sort of saying we need to continue to do our oil and gas industry ad infinitum, continue to open new wells. And that's not fair on the industry. It's not fair on people because they are in effectively stranded assets. There's an enormous amount of money to decommission these sites as well. And I'm not talking about it from an anti-oil and gas perspective. I recognise the role of oil and gas, particularly in our foundational industries and chemical industries. And we need to work out how to decarbonise these industries and electrify as many as possible. But there's still going to be the role for oil and gas in them. But that doesn't mean that you can give people false hope that we can just continue with the status quo.
And I mean, some people advocate that we need it for energy security. We've got the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. How much does energy security drive the desire for those homegrown supplies, whatever it may be?
When I signed net zero into law in 2019, we're in a totally different place now around energy security. And I think the energy security narrative actually helps the energy transition rather than hinders it. Some people want to talk about drill baby drill, and some countries have those fossil fuels that they want to then sort of claim as their own. Obviously, the big challenge is that we've seen with the oil prices. America could claim that it wants to produce domestic production and max it out, but it doesn't become possible. The economics are not there, and that's the challenge, I guess. Sometimes is the energy security angle will only work if economics are in its favor as well, and the price of the barrel of oil means that we can't compete with some countries, and I think with the UK we just don't have that supply there. We don't have the refining capabilities or tools, and most of our oil was going on international oil markets. It's not like you could just bottle this stuff up and put it in a storage unit and say, oh, this is UK oil, we're going to keep it for ourselves. Some politicians have tried to suggest domestic oil will be used domestically, and that's just not the reality of the way the international oil and gas markets sort of work. We need to be able to recognise that 80% of all countries, including the UK, are reliant on imports of fossil fuels. So we are, by default, reliant on foreign petrostates, which are 20% of the world. Whereas we could be independent in generating our own energy and become electrostates. I think the security of supply, the energy security question we really need to crack is obviously around the intermittency of wind and solar. And some really interesting things are happening now about how we're moving renewables into that baseload category so that they are being seen as a more secure option, combining wind and solar and batteries. And the battery thing is the real, and that's why I really want to focus on the UK Clean Power Task Force, is long duration energy storage is again emerging. And previously we've only been able to store up to 4 hours of electricity. There's 10 gigawatts of wind power that's being lost in Scotland due to shutting down the sort of turbines because the grid can't cope with it. That's a huge energy security opportunity. If we can bottle that wind power, that electricity, rather than wasting it, one day we'll look back in 50 or 100 years' time. Can you remember the days when they shut down the wind farms in Scotland and fired up the gas peakers in the south because our grid couldn't cope? And that's the energy security question. I think if we solve that, we will truly be energy independent for the future.
Yeah, well, Chris Skidmore, the recovering Member of Parliament, but hasn't quite managed to get out of the policy space. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
What do select committees have to say about clean power? The Energy Security and Net Zero Committee digs into the policy, spending and administration of the DESNZ department and its public bodies. Along with the EAC, we're the ones to ask the tricky questions on the government's environmental work. Claire Young is a member of the ESNZ Committee. She's a Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for Thornbury and Yates in the southwest of England. Harriet Cross is the Conservative Member of Parliament for Gordon and Buchan, a constituency in Aberdeenshire, and sits on the Scottish Affairs Committee. It has been examining the transition to net zero in Scotland's energy sector and how the UK government can support a transition that maximises opportunities for jobs and economic growth. Harriet, Claire, welcome to Committee Corridor.
Thank you for having us.
Hi, Toby.
So, Claire, Harriet, welcome. Both of your committees are looking into the transition to net zero. You've been taking lots of evidence, but may not yet be quite ready to report. We don't want to second guess any of the potential recommendations, as the committee members want to consider and agree those together. But we're very interested in your perspective on what you've been hearing. Let's start with you, Claire. The global energy landscape is making a big shift towards homegrown energy sources. Sounds good, wholesome, but can you set out what it really is?
Well, it simply means energy that's produced within the UK's borders. So that could be renewable energy, North Sea oil and gas, and nuclear. One of the things we do to try to achieve energy security. So the government's got its clean energy sector plan, and it's identified technologies where the UK has particular strengths, such as onshore, offshore wind, nuclear energy, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen heat pumps. And then there are other energies which aren't what they call frontier energies for the UK, but they're things like solar, bioenergy, storage, heat networks, and smart technologies.
Excellent. And your committee's been asking about the public support for the transition to clean energy. How is the government and indeed the sort of wider society getting on with the battle for hearts and minds on reaching net zero? What were you hearing on the issue of public support?
Obviously, the cost of energy is an issue for people, because you can't win hearts and minds if people are paying through the nose for their energy. Investing in renewable helps to bring down the wholesale prices, which account for about half a typical gas bill and just over a third for electricity. The problem at the moment is we're very exposed to the gas price, and therefore gas is setting the price most of the time, even when it's only making up a very small amount of the generation. So that's a problem, because people aren't going to be won over if they having to pay a lot for their electricity. So I think one of the things that's come out already is that 2/3 of the public are quite worried about energy security. So there are different ways you can talk about the government's energy policy. You've got trying to achieve the net zero goals in terms of carbon emissions. You've got the energy prices, which are very important for people, but people are also really worried about energy security. Obviously, the Ukrainian war has highlighted that. One of the things the committee's been asking about is just how you view renewable energy, whether you're looking at it from the net zero point of view or whether you're looking at energy security.
Yeah. And turning to you, Harriet, oil and gas have been a major contributor of employment, particularly in Scotland, but right across the supply chain in the United Kingdom, including manufacturing. And there's a real battle for hearts and minds there too. What does the transition to greener, more sustainable jobs look like, both for your constituents and for the UK more generally, in terms of what you've been hearing?
Yeah, thanks, Toby. The transition, it's not really a choice for us. It's absolutely necessary, especially in my constituency up in Gordon and Buchan, which is Aberdeenshire, which is the absolute heart of the traditional oil and gas sector. 1 in 3 jobs in my constituency are directly or indirectly related to oil and gas. It is so important that these jobs are looked after, transitioned across to whatever the future energy mix looks like, because it's not just in terms of job numbers, it's local skills, it's local economies, it's all the communities that are related to these jobs. So ensuring that the transition is properly just, whatever just means, is absolutely vital. So for us, that means that there is no cliff edge. So it's not that one day workers wake up with an oil and gas job and the next day they've got no job because the new industries haven't been put in place. It's making sure that the manufacturing capability is there. But so the jobs at the moment in oil and gas, which tend to be more on the operational side, become more on the manufacturing side. So you're effectively changing from OPEX costs to CapEx costs for jobs. It's making sure that the skills of the future and the apprentices and the graduates who are coming up are skilled to have the transition across to renewables, not just in the oil and gas sector. But it's also realizing that some jobs cannot be transitioned across. And I think a lot of oil and gas workers get really frustrated that the assumption is, oh, you'll just find another job elsewhere. It's fine. A lot of them won't. Like geologists, geophysicists, reservoir engineers, these are highly skilled jobs in a very niche market. And we need to realise that those jobs are very difficult to transfer across to, say, offshore wind, onshore wind, any other sort of renewables. And a lot of the people working in oil and gas at the moment are in their 40s. They've got a long time in their career left. So this transition is their transition. And if we make sure that we protect the oil and gas sector, support it, recognise that we will be using oil and gas for years to come, because we will, and that has been widely accepted from everyone from opposition, government, climate change committee, everyone recognises it. So we need to make sure that we're on a glide path, making sure that these jobs at the moment, where there could be 20 years left in the industry viably in North East Scotland, that will see a lot of these people to their retirement, because 30,000 jobs and 90,000 jobs in the UK, sorry, 30,000 in Scotland, 90,000 in the UK are at risk. Like, the scale of this is unbelievable. And one thing that really upsets, winds up, I don't know what the word is, people in my part of the world, is you see news, awful news about a factory down south closing, or a car factory closing, or impacts that, say, British Steel collapsing would have had, and there's a few thousand jobs impacted. Awful. But we're magnitudes more than that. That's the scale we're talking about. And that's why it's so important to us that this is managed properly.
Well, absolutely. And of course, we've already seen huge job losses in the oil and gas industry in recent years, haven't we? So this is something they're very aware of. And one of the questions the Scottish Affairs Committee has been wrestling with is the balance between the scaling up of the clean energy sector and the decline of jobs and investment in the oil and gas sector in Scotland. Can you just sort of explain what you think government should be doing to make that transition more successful?
I meet oil and gas companies and workers most weeks when I'm at home. The thing that a lot of them say to me is they just need time. They need time for the transition. And no one denies that we need to move to cleaner energies. Everyone understands what a finite resource is, and that is what oil and gas is. But we can't do it overnight, and we won't do it overnight sustainably. So we need time to build up a manufacturing base here, as I was saying, in order to transfer fuels across. We need time in order to get the pipeline of planning permissions for, say, offshore wind working through, in order to get those jobs of the future, although they don't compare at all. And we need time to make sure that the supply chains are absolutely vital, both to employment, of course, but also actually to the future of renewable energies. And the skills in those supply chains, especially in North East Scotland, are quite incredible.
Thank you. And Claire, making electricity cheaper will win over more people to making the transition to clean power. And that was a key recommendation from the government's independent advisor, the Climate Change Committee. From your committee's perspective, how are ministers planning to do that? And do you think it's going to be enough?
Well, I've already talked about the issues with the wholesale price and the fact that gas sets the price of electricity far too often. One of the other areas is policy costs. At the moment, most of the levies on bills in the UK are on electricity rather than gas. About 16% of an average domestic electricity bill, whereas it's only 6% of a domestic gas bill. That contributes to the UK having the worst price ratio between electricity and gas. So one of the things that the committee's been looking at is what you do with those levies, because you could move them straight onto gas, but that has problems for consumers, particularly vulnerable consumers, who may then struggle to pay their gas bills at a time when the most vulnerable people may be the people who would find it hardest to transition to new technologies. One of the other alternatives is to just move levies into general taxation. So you're not then moving it onto the gas, and with the negative impacts that has. There are also network costs. So about 24% of your electricity bill and 90% of your gas bill are from the network costs. NESO reckon that we'll need around twice as much new transition network infrastructure in the grid by 2030 as has been built in the past decade. And somehow you've got to fund that. Now, the government's looking at various ways to reduce the need to build that new grid infrastructure and use the existing infrastructure more efficiently. And that could be sort of demand side flexibility. So if you can find ways of helping consumers to use electricity when demand is lowest. I mean, you see this. My own electricity supplier has done a very simple thing where it's identified a time period on a Sunday when demand's lowest, and they give you a special price at that time to encourage you to do energy-intensive things at that time. But there are other bigger questions like locational pricing. So having different electricity prices in different parts of the country to try to encourage people to site energy-intensive uses in the areas where you've got the renewable power generation, so that you're not then having to pay people not to generate power from wind turbines, for example.
Yeah, and we know that last year, for the first time, renewable energy generated more than half of the UK's electricity. The gas-fired power stations still set much of the electricity pricing. Are we still too reliant on gas-fired power stations? And what does that say about the place of renewables in our energy generation sector?
Well, if you compare us to countries like France and Germany, we are still we've got a less diverse and more volatile collection of energy sources than those countries. In Germany, you've got a combination of hydro, coal and gas. In France, you've got a large amount of nuclear power generation. We're much more reliant on oil and gas, which is more exposed to price spikes. Trying to address that is key to bringing down our electricity prices.
Harriet, North Sea oil and gas production has been decreasing. You just reflecting on the number of jobs being lost in the industry. During your committee's evidence sessions, you asked about the difference to jobs if the North Sea basin was allowed to decline naturally and managed rather than permitting new licences and expediting the decline that way. What did you hear?
There's about 160,000 jobs in oil and gas onshore and offshore at the moment in the UK. And estimates for where we could get to if there is not a managed transition, i.e. sort of where we're looking at the moment, sort of ending support for the sector, sort of driving investment away from the sector. We're looking at something about 90,000 jobs being lost. Then, depending on the amount of support that is given in terms of effectively letting the industry support itself, so that means letting it actually invest, letting it have new licenses, letting it sort of get the rest of the oil and gas that it can out of the North Sea, of which by 2050 we could be still supplying half our oil and gas needs from the North Sea. So it's a substantial amount there, and there's enough employment and work and resource there to sustain the industry. Then obviously that 90,000 sort of figure drops and drops and drops in terms of how many jobs can be left. But it all comes down to decisions. So what we need to be doing is making sure that as oil and gas is declining, which it will, we all understand that. We know North Sea is a declining basin. It's a very mature basin, but it's not an empty basin. There are still jobs there to be had. There's still resource there to be had. There's still investments to be put in, and there's still businesses interested in the North Sea. But that will not be the case. And none of those other benefits, including the tax take, including the economic impact, including the skills retention and jobs retention and investment, especially in North East Scotland, none of that will be retained if we don't support the industry, or if we drive the industry away, or if we, for some reason, pretend that the industry doesn't have a place in our energy mix, because it does have a place in our energy mix. And the only way that we can sustain as many of those jobs as possible is getting the transition right.
Thank you, Harriet. Claire, the government has backed the new Sizewell C nuclear plant. Where does nuclear fit in?
It's important because it provides us with steady, predictable electricity that isn't dependent on the weather and allows us to reduce, therefore, our need for the gas generation. So, and if Sizewell B is extended to operate until 2055, and then you get Hinkley C, Sizewell C, and at least 3 Rolls-Royce SMRs all built, that would take the UK nuclear capacity back up to 9 gigawatts. But you've also got lots of reactors that are due to go out of service by 2030. So our total capacity is going to stay below the peak, which was back in 1995, unless we get further projects built. And obviously, the hope with SMRs is, and their modular nature, is that you can then replicate it. Once you've done one, you can do another. It becomes easier and cheaper to deliver over time. And we've also got to think about the fact the UK's electricity demand is going to double over the next few decades, because if we're switching people away from fossil fuels, it's going to do more heating, it's going to be providing much greater proportion of our transport energy use, then we're going to need even more electricity.
And a key part of delivering clean power by 2030 will be new infrastructure. Your committee's taken aim at the ending energy planning chaos. You're calling for early engagement and support for those hosting pylons, solar and wind farms, and consistent engagement, just as my own committee, the Environmental Audit Committee, did in its Sustainable Electrification report. Tell us what's getting in the way at the moment in terms of planning.
We need clearer guidance for planners and developers to align with the national strategic plans, like the Clean Power 2030 Action Plan and the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, It's no good having those plans and the other guidance not working alongside that. We need stronger enforcement on ecological and landscape commitments. So we want nature-positive infrastructure that integrates environmental and energy goals, which overcomes some of the objections to these schemes. It's about building earlier and deeper community engagement so that you can build trust and deliver more quickly. Grid connection viability should be a material consideration in planning decisions because at the moment there's obviously been a first come first served approach to grid connections. We need to make sure that we're, as a country, that we're prioritising those grid connections where there are viable planning projects, but equally you need to be able to consider whether those are deliverable when you're making a decision on whether something should go ahead.
Harriet, government's own research for the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero said clean power made up 92% of generation in Scotland in 2023, way ahead of the rest of the United Kingdom. It was 57% in England, even less in Northern Ireland and Wales. Is Scotland leading the way on renewables?
Scotland certainly is well set up in terms of natural resources for renewables. We've got huge amounts of sort of landscape which people may or may not want to put wind farms on. We've obviously got the offshore as well. We've also got the capability, which again comes back to the importance of retaining skills. We have the people, we have the industry knowledge, and we've got the supply chains to help deliver it as well. And yes, we have done well, but it hasn't come without a cost. So a lot of communities up in my neck of the woods in particular, but I know obviously in other parts of Scotland as well, we've got huge amounts of renewable energy infrastructure all over our landscape. I've got villages in my constituency, one called Ley Lodge, which is pretty small, but they've now got a 400 kV substation with obviously all the pylons coming in and out. They've got a 3 gigawatt hydrogen plant that's just been granted permission and 7 battery storage sites. And there's only about 50 houses in this community, but they feel like they've been completely taken over. And that's the same stories we're getting in places like Newdeer, Greens, Maud, all the way around my constituency. And so cost in terms of more than just financial cost has to come into this as well. So yes, Scotland have done well. Obviously, they were ahead of the game in terms of selling off the seabed under the ScotWind project. Did they get value for money for that for the taxpayer? Arguably not. It was quite undervalued. So there's pros and cons in everywhere. You can't just look at the full round number.
And a central plank of the government's strategy for clean power by 2030 is the need for a secure energy supply. Is the UK's energy supply more secure now? And by 2030, what's your view, Harriet?
While I think we'd like to think we're more energy secure, and because it's always nice to feel secure, I think if we look at it with a cold flannel on our heads, I don't think we are. And I think we're setting ourselves up for a huge hit as and when times coincide, especially as we increase our reliance on electricity and effectively reduce the amount of mix going into it, but our actual source of power to your homes or whatever. The more that we rely on just one thing, that's therefore creates more of a sort of a one fault system. And I do worry about we are leading ourselves up to whatever form it takes, a very insecure energy environment in the next few years. Maybe that's by 2030, maybe that's by 2040, 2050. I don't know. But I think it's something that we should all be wary of in our energy policy, because relying too much on one factor is risky.
Claire, as a West Country MP, what's your sense as to the extent that UK energy supply is more secure now?
Well, it's clearly not what you could call secure yet, because we've still got this reliance on the gas price, which obviously Russia's invasion of Ukraine highlighted. But as Harriet mentioned, there is this worry about the if you're importing all these the technology from China, MI5. It was reported were taking part in a review into their role in the energy system. They're trying to establish how much that leads to a potential future security threat. For example, in my part of the world, I've got Albury in my constituency, which is a potential site for new SMRs. Obviously, the government has identified Rolls-Royce as the preferred technology. So that gives us potential to develop our own expertise further and our own technology, which that does give us the potential for energy security. There are also other areas we could be looking at, for example, tidal range, where we have the potential in this country to become leaders in that.
Well, Claire Young, Harriet Cross, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Well, this is the final episode of this series. I've enjoyed my time as host, so thanks to all my guests today and everyone who's joined me along the way. We've been asking what happens when some of the big questions meet the government's environmental policy head on. The expansion of aviation, the UK's housing crisis, the pollution in our rivers and care of our oceans, and finally the drive for clean power. We've been sharing the latest work from select committees as they drive change in government policy based on evidence they receive from the key players and from you, the public. If you have any feedback or want to suggest ideas for further episodes, please do drop us a line to feedback@parliament.uk. I'm Toby Perkins, and this has been Committee Corridor. Thank you so very much for listening.